In the autumn of 1221, 30,000 Mongol horsemen descended through the rocky valleys of the Hindu Kush, convinced they would crush the last remnants of a dying empire. Behind them rode the shadow of Genghis Khan, the man who had made the world tremble from the Pacific to the Caspian. Nothing had survived his path. Not cities, not armies, not kingdoms. But what awaited that force in the narrow valley of Parwan was not surrender. It was not fear. It was not another people broken by terror. It was a man who had begun his journey with 300 horsemen and an oath that as long as he drew breath, the Mongols would learn the meaning of defeat. And when the two armies collided among the rocks, the silence shattered. Arrows whistled from the slopes, horses collapsed into the gravel, swords split shields. The entire valley became a grinder of flesh and steel. Men who had never known defeat screamed, and when the dust finally settled, thousands of Mongol warriors lay lifeless upon the stones. For the first time since Genghis Khan had unleashed his storm upon the earth, his army had been destroyed in open battle, and the echo of that afternoon would resonate from Afghanistan to the walls of Beijing, from the deserts of Persia to the steppes of Mongolia. Because one man, one last sultan, one prince without a throne, had done what no king, no emperor, no commander had achieved in 15 years of unstoppable conquest. He had stopped the horde. To understand how 300 fugitive horsemen became the fist that struck the jaw of the most lethal empire in history, one must go back 2 years, to a world that was crumbling apart. In 1219, Genghis Khan crossed the Tian Shan Mountains with an army of between 75,000 and 200,000 soldiers. His target was the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast expanse that stretched from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, ruled by Shah Muhammad II. The motive was blood. A Mongol trade caravan had been massacred in the border city of Otrar by order of a Khwarezmian governor. Genghis sent ambassadors demanding justice. The Shah responded by executing the envoys and shaving the beards of the rest, an insult that in steppe culture amounted to a declaration of total war. Genghis Khan's response was not a war, it was an extinction. The Mongol army split into columns that advanced with a precision the medieval world had never witnessed. Bukhara fell in February of 1220. Samarkand, the jewel of Central Asia, with its 100,000 defenders and its legendary walls, held out for barely 5 days. Genghis Khan unleashed 2 of his most lethal generals, Jebei and Subutai, with 30,000 horsemen to hunt down Shah Muhammad, who had fled westward. The pursuit was relentless. City after city crumbled in their wake. Tus, Kazvin, Ardabil, all were sacked as the Mongols tracked the fugitive emperor like wolves after a wounded deer. Muhammad II died in December of 1220, alone, sick, abandoned on an island in the Caspian Sea, dressed in rags, without a throne, without an army, without dignity. The greatest empire in Central Asia had evaporated in less than a year. But while the father was dying in exile, the son was about to be born as a legend. Jalal al-Din Mingburnu was the eldest son of Shah Muhammad. From a young age, he had demonstrated a military talent that his own father both envied and feared. Tall, strongly built, with a gaze that Persian chroniclers described as that of a hawk before it dives upon its prey, Jalal al-Din was not merely a warrior. He was a born strategist, a leader who inspired fanatical devotion in his men. In at least one battle, he had saved his father from a humiliating defeat against the Mongols themselves, displaying an audacity that contrasted sharply with the Shah's paralyzing cowardice. But Jalal al-Din carried a curse. He was the son of a concubine, not of the principal wife. And in the Khwarezmian world, that meant his right to the throne would always be questioned. The powerful queen mother, Turkan Khatun, despised him. She preferred Uzlak, a half-brother who was more malleable, more docile, easier to control. When Muhammad died and the news reached the capital, Gurganj, Jalal al-Din rode there hoping to claim the throne and organize the resistance. What he found was a conspiracy. The city's nobility, loyal to Turkan Khatun, rejected him. They planned to assassinate him, and in the night, warned by a loyal servant, the new sultan of the Khwarezmian Empire had to flee from his own capital. He left with 300 horsemen, 300 men on horseback, crossing through the gates of Gurganj in the darkness, leaving behind an empire that was sinking, with the Mongols closing the noose from the north and east, with his own family conspiring against him from the south. 300 horsemen against the world. What followed was one of the most extraordinary marches in military history. Jalal al-Din and his 300 crossed the Karakum Desert, one of the most merciless hells in Central Asia. Endless sand, crushing heat during the day, biting cold at night, without water, without shelter, without apparent hope. 16 days it took them to cross it, 16 days in which every dawn could have been the last, in which every dune could have concealed a Mongol patrol. 16 days riding past the carcasses of horses dead from thirst, drinking the blood of the animals they slaughtered, pressing forward with a determination that defied all logic. And on the other side of the desert, instead of seeking refuge, Jalal al-Din attacked. He fell upon a Mongol garrison near Nisa like a bolt of lightning in the night. The Mongols did not expect resistance. They did not expect anything alive to emerge from that desert. The garrison was annihilated. Among the dead were 2 brothers of Togachar, son-in-law of Genghis Khan. The blood spilled that night was a message that traveled faster than any horse. Someone had dared to strike the empire. Someone refused to die. The Mongols sent pursuit patrols. They hunted him beyond Nishapur, beyond Herat, across mountains and valleys. But Jalal al-Din moved like smoke, appearing where they did not expect him, vanishing before they could encircle him. And as he ran, news of his victories spread like fire through dry grass. In Ghazni, in the heart of what is now Afghanistan, 50,000 warriors were waiting for him. Men who had heard what the Mongols had done in Bukhara, in Samarkand, in Merv, where every Mongol soldier had been ordered to execute 24 prisoners. Men who had heard the tales of entire cities turned into mountains of corpses. Men who knew that surrender meant death, and that the only hope was a fugitive prince who refused to kneel. Shortly after, his maternal uncle arrived, Temur Malik, a veteran general, with 10,000 experienced Turkic warriors. The army grew. Afghans from the mountains, Turkic horsemen, Khwarezmian survivors, Ghurid warriors, all flocked to Jalal al-Din's banner. The Sultan, without a throne, now had 60,000 swords and a thirst for vengeance that no river could quench. The first blow fell on Kandahar, where a Mongol army was besieging the city. Jalal al-Din destroyed it in 2 days of fierce combat. Then he marched north toward Parwan, where another Mongol force was besieging a fortress. The Mongol garrison lost 1,000 men and fled, destroying the bridge behind them. It was the summer of 1221, and something unprecedented was happening in the world. Someone was winning against the Mongols. When news of these defeats reached Genghis Khan, the great Khan did not take it calmly. He sent his adopted son, Shigi Kutuku, his chief justice and one of his most trusted generals, with an army of between 30,000 and 45,000 horsemen. The order was simple: find Jalal al-Din and crush him. Kutuk was a Tatar raised in Genghis's own tent, a man who had learned the art of war from the greatest conqueror in history. He marched south with the absolute confidence of one who has never known defeat. Jalal al-Din was waiting for him in the valley of Parwan, north of Kabul, in the foothills of the Hindu Kush. And this is where the tactical genius of the last Khwarezmian Sultan blazed with its full intensity. The valley was narrow, rocky, flanked by steep mountains. The ground was covered with stones and gravel. It was the worst terrain imaginable for the Mongol cavalry. which depended on wide open spaces to execute their devastating flanking maneuvers and feigned retreats. In that gorge, the riders of the steppe could not deploy. They could not encircle the enemy. They could not use the speed that made them invincible. Jalal al-Din had not chosen that place by chance. He had chosen it as a trap. He distributed his forces with surgical precision. Saif al-Din Igrak, the leader of the Afghan warriors, commanded the left flank. Timur Malik, with his Turkic veterans, held the right flank. Jalal al-Din reserved the center for himself, the point where the pressure would be most brutal, where the Mongol steel would strike hardest, and he ordered his men to dismount. It was a decision that contradicted all military doctrine of the era. In a world dominated by cavalry, ordering your horsemen to fight on foot was considered an act of madness or desperation. But Jalal al-Din knew exactly what he was doing. On foot in that rocky terrain, his archers could fire with a deadly accuracy that was impossible from the saddle. On foot, the rocks became natural parapets. On foot, the Mongol advantage of mobility evaporated. On the first day of battle, the two armies met in the throat of the valley. Nearly 100,000 men, squeezed between mountains, with no room to maneuver, no place to hide. Kutuk launched his cavalry against Igrak's flank, expecting to break the line, as they had done in hundreds of battles before. But the Afghan archers, entrenched among the rocks, responded with a rain of arrows so dense that the Mongol riders crashed against an invisible wall of death. The horses fell, the men fell, and those who kept advancing found themselves facing warriors on foot who tore them from their mounts and killed them on the ground with axes and maces. The first day ended without a clear victor, but something had changed. For the first time, an army had withstood the Mongol charge and had not collapsed. The Khwarezmian warriors had bled, but they were still standing. And in the Mongol camp, for the first time in 15 years of unstoppable conquest, there was silence instead of celebration. On the second day, Kutuk attempted a desperate ruse. He mounted straw dummies on the spare horses to multiply the appearance of his army, trying to terrorize the enemy with a display of phantom numbers. It was a tactic that had worked against frightened peoples, against cities on the edge of panic. But Jalal al-Din did not frighten easily. He observed the decoy riders from his elevated position and smiled. The horses without real riders moved clumsily, lacking the coordination that distinguished actual Mongol cavalry from any imitation. On the third day, Kutuk decided there was no more room for subtlety. He hurled his entire army in a massive frontal assault, an avalanche of steel and fury meant to break the Khwarezmian resistance through sheer brute force. The Mongol cavalry charged uphill through the valley, their composite bows spitting arrows as the horses galloped among the stones. The sound was deafening, hooves against rock, metal against metal, human screams mixed with the shrieks of dying horses. The dust rose so thick that the combatants fought blind, striking at anything that moved, unable to distinguish friend from foe. On the right flank, the Mongols achieved a momentary penetration. 500 of Igrak's warriors fell under a particularly ferocious Mongol counterattack, their bodies crushed beneath the hooves of the steppe horses. For an instant, it seemed the line would break, that the dam would give way, that the Mongols would find the gap they always found. It was then that Jalal al-Din launched his charge. The Sultan spurred his horse and hurled himself into the center of the battle. Not from the rear, not directing from a safe hill as his father and so many other kings had done, from the very heart of the inferno. With his sword raised, with the Khwarezmian war cry tearing through the air, he rode straight into the Mongol line. His personal guards followed. Behind them, the reserve, and behind the reserve, every man who could hold a weapon. The charge was devastating. The Mongols, who were spread across the valley trying to exploit the breach, suddenly found themselves struck at the center by a concentrated force that acted like a lance-piercing armor. Jalal al-Din fought on the front line, his sword splitting helmets, his horse trampling the fallen. The Persian chroniclers would later write that he seemed like a lion among wolves, that his mere presence multiplied the courage of his men and sowed terror among the enemy. And then the unthinkable happened. The Mongols broke formation, not a tactical withdrawal, not a feigned retreat, that maneuver they had perfected into a deadly art, a real rout, disordered, chaotic. Warriors who had never turned their backs on an enemy wheeled their horses and fled down the valley, pursued by the triumphant cries of 60,000 throats. Kutuk tried to regroup his men, but panic is contagious, especially among troops who have never felt it. The horsemen stumbled among the stones, the horses slipped on gravel soaked with blood, and behind them, relentless, Jalal al-Din's warriors slaughtered them as they ran. When the killing ended, more than half of Kutuk's army lay upon the rocks of the Parwan Valley. The Mongol prisoners were executed with stakes driven through their ears, a symmetrical vengeance for the atrocities the conquerors had committed in Merv, in Samarkand, in Bukhara. Kutuku managed to escape with the remnants of his force, but the humiliation was total. It was the first time a Mongol army had been destroyed in open battle since Genghis Khan had begun his campaign of world conquest 15 years before. The valley of Parwan fell silent as evening came. A heavy silence, thick, laden with the smell of iron and death. Among the rocks, thousands of bodies formed grotesque carpets. Dying horses whinnied for a mercy that no one would grant them. The Mongol banners, those same standards that had flown above the ruins of 100 cities, lay trampled in the mud. And in the midst of that landscape of destruction, Jalal al-Din dismounted from his horse, drove his sword into the blood-soaked earth and looked north, toward where he knew Genghis Khan would be waiting. The chroniclers recorded that the Sultan sent a message to the great Khan after the battle, a message that crossed mountains and deserts to reach the ears of the most powerful man on earth. It said simply, "In what place do you want the battle to be so that we may march there?" The victory at Parwan ignited a rebellion that shook the foundations of Mongol rule in Central Asia. In Merv, a warrior named Kushtagin Palawan led an uprising that expelled the Mongol administration. Bukhara rebelled. Herat took up arms. Across the entire region, peoples who had been crushed beneath the Mongol boot raised their heads upon hearing that a single man with 300 horsemen turned into 60,000 had proven that the horde was not invincible. But history has a cruel sense of humor, and victory often carries within it the seeds of defeat. On the night after Parwan, while the warriors should have been celebrating and preparing for what was to come, a dispute erupted that would change the course of history. A white Mongol horse, captured as spoils, became the object of a fight between Timur Malik, Jalal al-Din's uncle and leader of the Turks, and Saif al-Din Igrak, the commander of the Afghan warriors. The argument escalated. Malik struck Igrak with a whip. Jalal al-Din, caught between family loyalty and justice, took his uncle's side. It was a fatal mistake. Igrak, humiliated and furious, gathered his Afghan warriors in secret. They left their campfires burning to simulate that they were still in camp, and in the darkness of the night, 30,000 Afghan warriors vanished like ghosts. When dawn broke, Jalal al-Din discovered he had lost half his army, not to Mongol swords, but to a white horse and the pride of 2 men. And Genghis Khan was coming. The great Khan did not delegate this time. He did not send generals or lieutenants. He gathered 50,000 warriors, reinforced by 3 of his sons, Chagatai, Ogadei, and Tolui, and marched south personally. Along the way, during the siege of Bamiyan, A poisoned arrow killed Motugen, his favorite grandson, the son of Chagatai. The Khan's fury transformed into something that went beyond military strategy. Bamiyan was erased from the face of the earth. Every living creature, human and animal, was exterminated. The Mongols afterward called it the Cursed City and forbade anyone from ever inhabiting it again. Jalal al-Din knew he could not face Genghis Khan with half his army. The tactical brilliance of Parwan would not serve against an enemy who now came with twice the force and a limitless thirst for vengeance. The Sultan made the most painful decision of his life, to retreat toward India. He marched east toward the Indus River, the last frontier before the subcontinent, dragging with him thousands of refugees who slowed his march. It was a race against time that he lost. The Mongols caught him on the banks of the Indus before he could cross. Jalal al-Din's army, now reduced to some 30,000 men, deployed with the river at their backs, with no possible escape. Genghis Khan arranged his forces in a crescent shape, cutting off any route of flight. 3 of his sons commanded the flanks. He himself commanded the reserve, personally ensuring that the Sultan would not escape. The Battle of the Indus was fierce. Jalal al-Din, as at Parwan, fought on the front line. His charges pierced the Mongol line again and again, pushing the invaders back in brutal hand-to-hand combat. But the numbers were overwhelming. The Khwarezmian flanks collapsed first. Timur Malik was captured. The reserve was annihilated. And when all was lost, when the encirclement closed like a steel jaw, Jalal al-Din did something that would be engraved in the memory of both peoples forever. He spurred his horse toward the edge of the cliff that overlooked the Indus River, swollen by the rains, roaring, deadly. Without removing his armor, without releasing his sword, without looking back, he leapt into the void. Horse and rider plunged into the turbid water from a height that would have killed any ordinary man. The Mongol archers rushed to the edge to finish him off. They drew their bows, they aimed, and then Genghis Khan raised his hand. He stopped his own archers. He stood watching as that tiny figure fought against the current, sword still in hand, dragging his horse toward the opposite bank. And when Jalal al-Din reached the far shore, soaked, bleeding but alive, Genghis Khan turned to his sons and spoke words that the chroniclers recorded with astonishment. Every father should wish for such a son. It was the greatest praise the conqueror of the world had ever bestowed upon an enemy. Jalal al-Din survived. He crossed into India, where he wandered for years, a king without a kingdom, a general without an army. Eventually he returned westward, settling in Persia and the Caucasus, where he spent a decade fighting against Georgians, Seljuks, and Ayyubids, trying to rebuild an empire that no longer existed. He died in 1231, killed by Kurdish bandits in the mountains, an ignominious end for a man who had defied the master of the world. But the Battle of Parwan outlived its protagonist. The rebellions that Jalal al-Din inspired in Merv, Bukhara, and Herat were crushed with a brutality that scarred the land for generations. The Mongols, furious at the humiliation, redoubled their ferocity. But something had changed. The legend of Mongol invincibility had received its first crack, and from that crack, others would be born. In Jalut in 1260, where the Mamluks would halt Mongol expansion in the Middle East, Kulikovo in 1380, where the Russians would prove that the Golden Horde could bleed. Each of those victories had a distant ancestor in that stony valley of the Hindu Kush, where a prince without a throne, with 300 horsemen and a will of iron, proved that no empire is eternal. There are battles that decide borders, there are battles that decide dynasties, and there are battles that decide something deeper, something that lives in the hearts of peoples for centuries. Parwan did not change the map of the world. It did not stop the Mongols. It did not save the Khwarezmian Empire, but it proved a truth that all the tyrants of the world fear to hear. That brute force, however overwhelming, can never fully extinguish the flame of human resistance. Jalal al-Din began with 300 horsemen in a desert. He crossed hell. He assembled an army from nothing. He defeated the invincible. And when all was lost, he leapt into an impossible river with his sword still in his hand. Not because he thought he would win, but because there are men who are born incapable of surrender. And sometimes, just sometimes, those men change the course of history. The wind still blows among the rocks of Parwan, and if one listens carefully, one can still hear the echoes. Hooves upon stone, steel against steel, and the voice of a sultan without a throne who told the conqueror of the world, "Tell me where you want the battle to be, and I will be there."